Hi there, hello and welcome. This is Jamie. I'm the owner of Bar I Liquid Accounting. And let me quickly explain. This is the first in a series of many videos that we're going to use as part of our training process. So we're calling this a video series, and this is the idea behind it. Let me quickly explain. So there's obviously a lot of pieces to the puzzle about running our small business. Like all things, it's more complicated than you think when you dig into it. And so from our perspective, we're a little concerned as we look forward towards franchising that we need to have all this knowledge about how to handle things and how we do things at Bar I, and we have to train and communicate that knowledge to all of our new employees and our new franchisees. And just in terms of the volume of information, it's quite a big task. And then from your end, as an employee or franchisee, equally, there's a lot of information you need to take on and need to learn. And so we thought the best way to do this would be to produce a series of short videos. I suspect this one's going to be long, but in general, I'll try and keep the videos sort of 5 to 10 minutes long, and we'll put them into an email series. So once a day, you can get sent a video, and just sitting back, watching, listening each day, 5 to 10 minutes of your time over a few weeks and months. This will build up to be a pretty significant contribution to your learning. So that's the idea behind this. This will be the first of many. And thank you to Jeremy, who pointed out we constantly referred to these four things whenever we're doing inventory, and it took a while, I guess, for him to understand why this is as important as it is. And so we chose this as a good high-level topic, or a good understanding. But if you understand these four things and understand what they mean and how they relate to what we do as a business, that will put you in a good position to be doing a good job of providing work for your clients. So here goes. So the four things. So the whole point of Bar I is to provide an easy way for bars to precisely compare how much product is sold at their bar versus how much is actually poured. And as we've said, to do this, for each product, you only need to know four things. You need to know the previous count, the amount that was delivered or invoiced, the current count, and the amount sold. So let's have a think about this by running through a solid example. So using bottles of Bud as an example, let's say you started with 100 bottles of delicious cold Budweiser beer, and then you sold 75. Obviously you should have 25 left. By doing a basic audit, you could check this. So let's say following or the previous Monday morning, we did a count of all of our Budweiser bottles. Perhaps we found them in multiple different spots. We found them in the main cooler in the bar. Then we found them in the back in the walk-in cooler. They had stacked up cases, and then maybe they had even more cases in dry storage somewhere. But either way, we counted up all the bottles of Budweiser that were at the bar in the various locations they're stored and determined there were 100. And then during the course of the week, we sold 75, and therefore we know we should have 25 left. And so this Monday, we came back to do a little check to complete our audit, and we counted all the Budweiser again, and we found that we had 20. And we know that we should have had 25, and actually we have 20, so we concluded that we're missing 5. So that's basically the essence of what we're doing here. We're trying to tell them how much they're missing, and let's continue this idea and develop it and see. Let me explain it with some more concrete examples. So another complication we've got is, well, what about if we had deliveries during the week? How would that complicate things? We'd have to know that piece of information, because that would obviously affect the number we're expecting to find and therefore our calculations. So using that above example, imagine we got 100 bottles of Bud delivered at the start of the week. I'm keeping the math easy because obviously Budweiser comes in cases of 24, so we'd get a delivery of 96, not 100, but bear with me. So looking down here, let's say we started the week with 100, and then we had 100 delivered. Obviously that means we had 200 to start with. And then we sold 75. That would mean we'd expect to find 125. So that's how the deliveries, or the number of deliveries, would feed into this calculation. And let's just think about a subtle difference, because what's really important here is we understand how these different numbers, or what they all mean, and how they multiply together to give sense to this. And there's something that's a little bit confusing that I'm going to try and explain here. So I want to clarify the difference between what we're trying to do, which is comparing how many were sold versus how many were poured, and what we're actually doing here in practice, which is comparing the expected count versus the actual count. So you'll notice that I started by explaining and saying that we wanted to compare how many were wrung and how many were poured. But in actual fact, what I did was compare how many we expected to find with how many we did find. Basically, those are two sides of the same coin, and so let me explain that. So going back to originally what we're trying to do, if we're trying to compare the number sold versus the number poured, in the above case, the number sold is 75 and the number poured is 80, and that's how we concluded that we're missing 5. But we never actually counted how many were poured. What we did was we backed it out from the numbers. So running through that example again, we know that the previous count was 100 and the current count was 20. That means you used 80. The software does this though in a subtly different way. What we do is we compare the previous count, we compare the expected count with the actual count. So let's run through that. So the previous count, in that case 100, plus the number delivered, another 100, means we started with 200, and the number sold 75, so we minus that 75 from the 200 we started with, and we get an expected count of 125. Compare the expected count with the current count. So, using the example, if we had delivered, we have 125 plays 120. Again, we're missing 5. So just saying that the expected count was 125, but the actual count was 120, means we can conclude we're missing 5. And it's just a different way of saying that we sold 75 but poured 80, and therefore we're missing 5. So this whole idea about comparing the number sold versus the number poured, a different way of digging into the problem in the same way is to compare the number you expect to find with the number you actually find. And that's, in practice, how the software does it. But those two things is just two different ways of explaining the same thing, which is knowing if beer is going missing, knowing if people are making sure that they're selling all those bottles of Budweiser they're serving. So this seems relatively easy. A little bit complicated. We had to consider the deliveries and all of that stuff, and old count, current count. A little bit confusing. But in general, it wasn't that difficult of a calculation. So if bars are losing money doing this, why aren't they doing this basic check? Well, we did the example with bottles of beer, bottles of Budweiser, but it's more complicated when we try and do this same comparing how many servings were wrung versus poured for draft beer, liquor and wine. And let's have a think about 4 reasons why that's the case. So the first of all we have is the counting problem. We sell draft beer, for example, in 16-ounce pint glasses, but when we do inventory we count kegs, meaning we need to convert how many kegs. So for instance, if we knew that there was half of a keg there last week, we have to convert half of a keg into how many servings were there. Well, that should be relatively easy to do. We just take the number of ounces in a keg and then the number, divide it by the number of ounces we serve. Well, we need to configure some other things like how much head we leave on the beer. And really when you get into it, you start to see that this is not quite as simple as you want in practice. But that counting problem just refers to the fact that when we count the inventory, we count it in full units or in kegs. And then when we're trying to do this comparison, we're trying to do it based on servings. And so that's one challenge, is that we've got this mismatch between the units we count in and the units we sell in. And we need to convert one to the other in order to be able to do this calculation. The second problem or reason bars aren't doing this is basically just a straight time problem, which is it's time consuming to do this. Using the example above where we had 100 delivered, I was able to pluck that number out of thin air. But with a bar, you're talking about picking up their delivery invoices, and during a week they'll have perhaps 10 different deliveries from 5 different distributors, and so they'll have 10 different pieces of paper that tell them what was delivered, and they have to compare, or they have to do all of that data entry for those 10 deliveries. Maybe they had 5 items, so actual fact they got 50 different product deliveries. And so we're not doing this for just one product, we're doing it for perhaps 200 at the bar, and doing that line by line accounting of what was delivered is time consuming, and so often it gets missed. So the time problem is another reason that's not happening. Another issue is a point of sale problem. Let's think about Grey Goose, high-end vodka product Grey Goose. If we want to know how much Grey Goose is sold in a bar, how do we figure that out? Well, what we do is we go into their point of sale system where they ring up all their sales, and we go into the back of house function, which enables you to run all sorts of different reports, and we run a sales report for the given week, and it will tell us how many Grey Goose cocktails were served, because each time the bartender serves a Grey Goose cocktail, they press the Grey Goose button in the system records that, and then we can tally up how many Grey Gooses were sold in the week just by doing a report between two certain dates. What about, though, martinis? Sometimes people like Grey Goose in a martini. So in that case, we have to add together the number of ounces that were sold in cocktails versus the number of ounces that were sold in martinis. And typically, a cocktail is going to be 1.5 ounces, whereas a martini will be a bigger pour, perhaps 2.5 or 3 ounces. So now, to figure out how much Grey Goose has been sold, we need to add up the number of ounces that were sold as cocktails, which would be the number of cocktails times 1.5 ounces, and add together the number of martinis that were sold by 2.5 ounces or 3 ounces. In actual fact, I'm not going to bore you with or go into too much detail, but for that reason, the difference between the martinis and the cocktails, and a bunch of other different reasons, it's not quite as simple as being able to pull a report that says how many shots of Grey Goose you sold, because Grey Goose goes into lots of different drinks in different amounts, and again, you can't simply pull out how many shots of Grey Goose, how many ounces did I use. You have to back it out, you have to figure it out, and that's why we come into is helping them solve this problem. The fourth and final problem about why this isn't getting done at bars, why they're not performing this check and balance, and why they're allowing themselves to lose money by doing this, is an independence problem. If I'm the person that's giving away those bottles of Budweiser to my friend or to my girlfriend, either just for fun or to get extra tips, I don't want this check to be made. I don't want the owner to know that I've given away 5 bottles last week, because he's going to put a stop to it. So another problem is that sometimes the managers are part of the problem. Sometimes they are bartending as well as managing, and perhaps they don't want this light to be shone to see what the heck's going on at the bar. So for all those reasons, in general, we did our basic little sort of thought experiment how this would work with Bud bottles, but in general, bars are not doing this because of those 4 problems: the counting problem, the time problem, a point of sale issue, and the independence problem. How does that all shake out in the results? What's the end result? Well, due to the challenges mentioned above, most bars simply don't figure out a way to do this. They don't realize it's something that's as valuable as it is, or they realize it is and don't get around to it. But one way or another, most bars are not doing this. What they do instead is they calculate their liquor cost. We'll go into detail. You become very familiar with liquor cost if you're not already. But liquor cost in general is a much more simple measure. What it does is it mashes together, or it aggregates the results of lots of different products into a number by category, and it means that you can't see what's going on with individual products. So the trouble with liquor cost, it's not granular enough of a measure, we would say. With this example, we're trying to know how many bottles of Bud were rung and how many were poured. That's very granular because we're dialing down into individual products. Whereas because it's easier to do this, most bars just calculate a percentage cost by category. So they'll be able to tell you what the percentage cost is for draft beer, bottled beer, liquor, and wine, but they don't go into any more detail than that. So they use their liquor cost, it masks problems, and the end result is that most bars lose between 15 and 25% of the product they're pouring due to inventory shrinkage. What does that mean using the rung and poured example? Well, it means that typically the number sold is lower than the number actually used by about 15 or 20%. So using our Budweiser example, we sold 75, but we poured 80. So that actually would be better than most bars are doing. That might surprise you, but most bars are losing between 15 and 25 per 100. Using our example, we were only using 5 per 75 we sold, whereas most bars instead are losing between 15 and 25 per 100. Anyway, so by precisely comparing how many servings were poured versus actually sold, we identify problems so that they can be fixed and help make bars more profitable. Pretty simple. Obviously, if we gave away 5 bottles of Budweiser, while the bartender might have got a bigger tip, the bar has lost out money. If they had sold those Budweisers for $5 each, they'd have $25 more, and the bar would be making more money. So that's the essence, or that's the point of this. But it all comes back to being able to compare how many servings were rung versus poured for every single product at the bar. If we only do this for Budweiser, then Budweiser numbers are going to be good, but we're going to have problems with Grey Goose, or we're going to have problems with Coors Light. So it's important that bars do this for every single product at the bar. And apologies, all they need to know in order to do this is 4 pieces of raw information, which are the number sold. We talked about that. That's what we're going to compare. We're going to compare the number sold with the number used. The number sold, we can pull out the point of sale. The next thing we need to know is these three next pieces of information will combine to tell us what the bar has used. So we need to know the previous count, what was there originally. We need to know what was delivered or invoiced during the period, and we need to know the current count. So let's just run through these using our Bud Light example. So in our case, we used earlier, the number sold was 75. The previous count was 100. The amount invoiced was 100, and the current count was 120. So how do these four pieces combine to allow us to compare how many were sold versus actually poured? Well, as we saw, the quantity sold is information which, for the most part, with a few calculations and adding things together, is information which is available in the point of sale system. So now we need to determine how many were actually used so we can compare the two. So we take the previous count and we minus from the current count, and it tells you how much you used. Using the first example, we started with 100, we had 20, and it tells us that we used 80. But if we had deliveries, we need to account for those as well. So in actual fact, the quantity used is the previous count, 100, plus the number invoiced gets us to 200, minus the current count of 120 identifies that we used 80. So let's take a look now. We're going to dive right in and show you how this plays out in our actual software by looking at an audit which we recently completed. So don't be too bewildered by the number of or amount of information on the screen. Let's just dial in and look at this one row of Bud bottle, and this is for an existing client of ours. So they're actually missing the same number of Budweiser. This is real numbers. These numbers aren't going to be as easy to work with, but you can see that we are quoting here that we're missing 5 bottles of Budweiser. Well, how did we figure that out for this client? Well, when we were there previously, we counted 83 bottles of Budweiser. And then during the week, they had 192 delivered. And then we know that they sold 154. We say rung or sold because they're rung into the point of sale. So if you combine those three pieces of information, what they had previously, what they had delivered, and then minus what they sold, it will tell you how many you should have. In this case, we should have had 121. Let's just do the math for you to make sure about that. So equals, if we started with 83, then we added 192, and then we sold 154, we should be finding 121. In actual fact, at the bar, we counted and we found 116, and so if we take the difference, we should have found 121, we actually found 116, so the missing number is 5. So that's one way of looking at it. That's how the software does it. And let's just think one more time about, in actual fact, what we want to do for the client is told them how many we rung versus how many we poured. Again, it's the exact same thing. If you compare how many we rung and poured, you conclude that we are missing 5. So let's think about how we figure those things out. So the number rung is pretty simple. That's just pulled out of the point of sale system. And because we're dealing with bottles of beer, that's simple. We can just look up how many times they sold Budweiser bottles, 154 times in this case. Then, if we want to know the number poured, we need to combine these three information. The previous, what was invoiced, and today's count. So let's do that and see what we come up with in terms of what they'd poured. The number actually is 159. It shows here, but I want to just confirm for you that that's true. So the number poured. So let's have a look. So if we started with 83 and then we had 192 delivered, we started with 275 bottles. If we then today only found 116, we know that we've used 159. So that's two different ways of figuring out the same thing. We can either say you rang 154, you sold 154, but you poured 159, meaning you're missing 5. Or we can say the expected count was 121, but the actual count was 116. Either way, we conclude we're missing 5. So I hope this has been helpful as much as it's been confusing. Understand that this is confusing. You'll probably want to watch this and go over this a few times, and don't worry, these basic ideas will be built on. We'll go over them many times. But in general, bar I is trying to compare how many was rung versus how many were poured to see how many is missing. And we can do that by combining 4 pieces of information. And there's sort of 2 techniques. We either use that information, the raw data, the 4 things, to compare how many were wrung versus poured, or in actual fact, what we do in practice is we use those 3 amounts to calculate what we're expecting to find, and then we compare it to what we actually find. Either way, we tell them what's missing, we sum it together. You can see this is a good client of ours. You can see their overall score was 5.6%, and actually in the case of bottled beers, these guys rang up 1,267 beers and they poured 1,273. It means they're only missing 6, which is great, and that's an improvement because last week they were missing 50. So when you do this on a macro scale, as in when you add it up, you see these guys have got a crazy amount of bottles of beer, and by doing this for every single bottle of beer, you can see this is a really good performing client. You can see their numbers are really good, and the number of bottles missing are pretty small for this bar. There's a few offsets up and down, but in general, they're doing a great job here. So that's the end of the 4 things video. I'm sorry this one's long. Hope it's useful. Please, by all means, send me an email if you want something explained better, or if you have an idea for a different video you'd find helpful. And as always, thanks for watching.